What inspires you to do this work?
I'm most impressed by the movie, The Connection to the Land, and I guess it resonates with me, having grown up, although in an industrial city in the Northeast, on the edge of that city where there was so much nature, and so my love for the earth. I should mention I'm also in the geography department first and foremost. It comes from that tangible connection to the earth, and so when I saw it in this film, it really resonated with me.
Yeah, for me, I've come into looking at environmental issues actually through more of a kind of question about how inequalities in the U.S. have really been sustained around the ways we make decisions about managing land and water and things like that. And what I found really interesting, especially in the film, was that you could kind of see how those questions of power differences, I think, that the students were recognizing also in kind of pursuing their environmental research projects was very interesting, and it resonated with me in terms of trying to think about the wider kind of field of power and inequality that is also operating around a lot of these environmental issues, and who gets to make those choices, and also how we can approach different solutions. So that's part of my inspiration, and I liked seeing that in the film as well.
Hi, I'm also inspired by the disparities that are present when it comes to environmental activism, and how strong or how deep the differences between the different root causes of climate change and how they impact the different communities are, and especially when you see this in regards to how environmental issues can bleed into our culture and how we view other communities, and especially how so many large-scale corporations are willing to put the health and livelihood of other people at risk just to make money for that.
I guess the thing that sort of inspires me the most is I feel like especially in the U.S. we tend to ignore things that are happening because it's not directly related to us. So I guess because we outsource all of our pollution, or we sort of, we shove it under the rug. So I think the idea of bringing environmental issues to the forefront and dealing with them through science and innovation is really important.
I'm going to ask one more question, then I'm going to turn it to the audience. And really just jumping off the point you just made, in the movie, one of the women said, you need to know it exists in order to be concerned, right? And so it's at that point of how do you help people know it exists? So I'd love to hear, each of you have done work in this space, how do you help people know it exists who might not know it exists? And of course, we're in the political climate we're in. How do we get people to care when it's not in their backyard?
We're such visual people that we often need something that's very, very visual. And it's the climate change issue is so interesting in this regard. You can look at places where the signs are already very visible, but they often aren't right here in our backyards. There are a few, and some really interesting ones. Sea level rise is the most prominent. Sort of urban flooding in Charleston is another example. You can look at places that are getting inundated from saltwater intrusion, moving up farther and farther upstream in some places. So I think creating those sort of visual spaces becomes quite important. It's interesting to see the contrast between some things that are very visible. I mean, when you see foam blowing across an urban landscape, that's dramatic, right? But most of the time, it's not anything near that. So arsenic buried in the ground and making that visible is sort of very intriguing to see the differences in the visual nature of it.
Yeah, I definitely think that question of when you can see certain environmental changes happening and when you can't, and there are certain things like a lake catching on fire that's a lot more immediate than things like sea level rise, or where I've worked a lot in Louisiana is this idea of the coast disappearing, but it's going to happen in 20, 30 years, 50 years, and I often find myself in meetings about these things thinking about, well, who's going to be here in that? That's multiple generations even after me, and I often think about younger folks, right? We're talking about your future, right, and what you're going to be looking at, and I think one of the ways to get people, and especially younger folks, into it is figuring out ways to get out there and try and do the science or kind of go out there and engage with those issues. I think it's one of the ways to really make it more immediate. Although I don't know, y'all can speak probably better to that than I can, but for me, that's one thing that's important.
I think one way to get more people involved with environmental issues is
Is your mic
definitely.
on? It doesn't sound the same. I'm
So,
sorry.
a little bit closer.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
there we go.
So I think
Thank
one
you.
way to definitely get people more involved with environmental issues would be to change the dialogue that is present when we're discussing them. Like they mentioned earlier in the film, a lot of the times when people are talking about climate change and stuff like that, the words that they use are very intimidating, and they're not words that like a lot of people understand. And I know that for me, when I first began like researching environmental issues, and I was looking at the Flint water crisis, and they were talking about like the lead in the water and like the EPA levels, it was all very overwhelming. But I actually had to take the time to like sit down and figure everything out and really reword it and restructure it in ways that I could understand. And that's how I've been informing people about issues such as environmental discrimination. I've really been approaching them, not necessarily casually, but in a way that's relatable so that they'll be able to understand what's truly going on. Because I think there's this like misconception that a lot of people don't care about environmental issues, but it's not that they don't care, it's just that people aren't presenting it in a way that is something that they can understand.
I think one of the main problems, you're saying.
Mike. Yep.
Yeah, I don't know.
Here.
I'll just give you this one.
Is that it?
So I think a lot of the times environmental issues tend to be politicized, or like I think it sort of tends to get lost in like people fighting back and forth and related to economic problems. But I think one of the main things you can do is like make it get data. So like if you can, it's more difficult to argue with facts than it is to argue with sort of attacks against like certain stances. So I think one of the main things you can do to raise awareness for environmental issues is sort of spread the word about science being collected and technologies that are being developed. So.
Thank you. Questions from the audience? Yep. In the back there?
Arsenic, you can take that byproduct and do something with it. And the other technologies and combination with it, that could be another whole other industry, an arsenic type of thing. Take one particular instance, taste, next particular instance, it's actually valuable. So
Can you just hold the mic up closer, it's hard to see. Okay.
What about the combination of these ideas? You get the waste here and the waste there, recycle.
So kind of a question of how do we deal with all of this waste that's out there, whether it's from arsenic or from tin or whatever it
It could
is.
be turned into something positive.
Is there a way to turn the waste into something positive?
Material, semiconductor, or other.
Anyone have something?
I don't know much to say on this, but there are, there certainly are examples where in things that I know a little bit more about, where we're trying to do carbon capture, for example. It's a really tricky business, but there are, at least at a small scale level, some success stories of converting carbon into something else, right? It's a net neutral effect, right? That we can turn carbon from plants that are emitting it into synthetic fuels. It doesn't save anything, but it's happening now because it's profitable, right? So that's one sort of tangential example of recycling, I suppose, in some ways. What we really want to do is bury it, but it only makes any money out of doing that, so it's stifled.
I know that's one of the things they're getting at with biofuels, is the idea that it would be net zero carbon released into the atmosphere.
I saw another question in the middle. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I do research. I do nutrition research. And I beg to differ that data is interesting, or that anyone cares about it. I think what people care about is taking that data because my background is film and television, and from that I came into research. It's making the connection to their actual lives. We have a boatload of data. We have a boatload of data of childhood obesity. Nobody cares. People started to care because the military can no longer just go to our young people and say, we can take a swath of 200 people and 150 of them will be able to go into the military. It became important, the school lunch program became important when we saw a connection to an actual person thing. And I think that some of the stuff that hit all of us were the images of floating foam, of brown sea. It's that next step that makes this data that is whatever that is into something that I can grasp, that I can see, that I understand. I'm from Cleveland. They have worse water than Flint. And so data on it didn't really make any difference. Looking at the fact that we have kids that are creating more problems and costing more money because they need more help is actually what is beginning to make the change.
So maybe I'd love to hear, based on that question from especially the two of you, all four of you, the specific stories about how you've got people to care about what you're working on, what data you've used, but then how you turn that data into something that's gotten people to care about the issues you're working on.
Okay, so for me, I know that I was researching the Flint water crisis issue, and at surface level, it's just something like, oh, it's terrible, their water is poisoned, they can't drink it. But then when you look into the effects of lead poisoning, you realize how deep the issue really runs. Lead poisoning is irreversible, there's no cure for it, and even though there's treatment that can be provided for it, it costs like thousands of dollars, and many of the people in the community just can't afford it. Lead poisoning, mainly specifically when it affects children, it causes them to become more aggressive and more hostile, and they can develop learning disabilities, which makes them more likely to drop out of school and engage in criminal activity. And then all of these issues combined together, really, they fuel identities that are already associated with minority and impoverished communities, and a lot of people who've been affected by lead poisoning don't even know it. So once I presented this issue to my friends, it struck a chord with a lot of them because we know people that can live in communities like this. We know people like this. So I think the way that I have made what I found out more impactful is just by seeing that even though it may not directly affect you, it probably affects someone that you know. And knowing that the stuff that happens to them is for life and there's nothing that they can do about it, and seeing so many people that have had their lives derailed just by one simple decision just to make money, it like touches the hearts of a lot of people, and that's how they become more connected to the issue.
One of the things.
That was really close.
Don't be nervous.
Yeah, you're good.
One of the things that's been, well, recently, or not recently, it was last year, they cut off funding for schools, so they can't transport recycling from our schools to the recycling plant. So we have not had recycling at our school for like an entire year now. So, and one of the problems is actually getting people to care, because it's not like the trash is piling up. Like, it's not like the recycling is just piling up. It's like being thrown away. So people aren't really like noticing. So that's actually one of the problems we've had, is like getting really the administration to move or do anything about it. So yeah, we're gonna start like a recycling, like bringing waste to the plant and like weighing how much we're bringing, so we can present the data, like this is how much we were throwing out, which we could have been recycling, and presenting that to administrations, and hopefully after I graduate, they'll take some action on that.
Yeah, great. Yep.
I think a bit of a kind of follow-up on that, because I think this question about like data is actually a really important one, and I think in terms of intergenerational differences in thinking about environmental issues, because I think there's a feeling around folks who've been looking at and studying environmental issues for a long time, feeling frustrated, right? Like,
we have the data, it's there, we just don't know how to get people to care about it, and I think that's a valid point to make, and I wonder, especially from your perspectives, if you feel like a kind of younger coming up generation has a different relationship to data, if you will, like if you feel like, you know, the administration maybe doesn't get it, right? They're kind of old guard, but maybe the students do in a different way. So I'm kind of curious to know if you feel like there's a difference between what you see in terms of how, you know, parents or folks older than you deal with that data versus how you and your friends think about it.
So I know that for me, especially with the friend group that I have and a lot of the people that I know, we're really, really skeptical. And I think that just comes as a part of being a generation based on the internet. We've always been taught all throughout our lives, you can't trust everything that you see or don't take everything at face value. So I feel like personally, we value data more because it's like a fact. It's nothing that can be disputed, and it helps like provide concrete evidence for opinions and beliefs. So I feel like, of course, no matter what, you're always going to get that one person that sees the numbers and they see the stats and they just don't care. But I feel like now, especially with my generation, when we see the data and we see the evidence that can back something up, it helps us create like a stronger opinion and belief behind things.
Yeah, I personally, I put a lot of faith in data, and it sounds like you do too. But I think a lot of the, like, sometimes when I talk to my mom about this stuff, it's like she can tell me like what it was. This is what it used to be like, and like I grew up in it, like it was like this when I grew up. But for me, it's like the only thing I've been able to compare is with data, just because I haven't experienced a lot of the changes that have happened over the course of the last, like, I don't know, however long. So I think data is sort of like the one way we can connect to the changes that have happened in the world. So I know that I put a lot of faith in it, and I think it's really important.
Yeah, let's go to the very back.
I'm just wondering, what do you think is which environmental problem do you think should receive the most attention or the most energy or the most work in the Midlands?
I'm going to say climate change, of course, because that's what I do. Yeah, you know, these things are really interesting because they go from our backyards to the globe, right? And in these examples, they started in backyards, but the idea of, and I think Sahita said it best, that the problems are so similar in so many other places. So it's earth and it's water, right? And how climate ultimately affects that would be my take on it. But in the Midlands, air quality is an issue, particularly in the summer months, and water quality is an issue year round. So I would say those two.
Well, I'm pretty new to the Midlands, so I can't really speak that much to that. But in general, and not to a particular environmental issue, I think there needs to be a bolder conversation about the policies we're developing and how we actually regulate a lot of our uses around the environment, and thinking more proactively about who's having to deal with those consequences in a lot of the environmental problems as opposed to others, and using the tools of law and policy to try and address those problems, in addition to doing good science and making good data. I think they need to go together because it seems to be a kind of cultural problem, I guess, in some ways, how we think about and how we relate to the environment. So every place has its own issues, but I think trying to push towards those shifts has a lot to do with how we regulate and pass legislation and think about how we want to engage with the environment.
I think another issue, or an issue that we really need to address, is like the proper disposal of waste. And also we need to analyze how our infrastructure handles waste management. For me, I know a lot of the times people just, like, you can walk down the street, you just see like trash everywhere because people just really aren't being mindful about how they're disposing of the waste that they have. And I also know instances of people who, when they do try to recycle, they can go weeks without their recycling being picked up by the people that are supposed to pick them up. So I feel like we really need to target how we dispose of all the products, because they aren't like pollution, and the pollution that we see every day, it can have so many indirect impacts upon different parts of the environment. And also, even when people are trying to do the right thing, if the infrastructure isn't allowing them to do that, then we kind of fall back into the ground of pollution again.
One of the things that, I mean, Columbia, it's
Oh
just.
God, we cannot.
Better?
We can't hear you.
Yeah, there, that's perfect.
Okay.
Yep.
All right, sorry about that.
Thank
Columbia is just sort of an urban sprawl. Like, there's a lot of development and not a lot of efficiency and use of space, like a lot of sort of big parking lots that are empty all the time. And I think just a non-efficient use of resources. So I think maybe policies, if policies were developed that would help, I think there's a word for it, where you're not developing on new land, you're using old land that's. Thank you. Brownfield. Yes, that's what it is. If there was more initiative taking action on brownfield development and also water quality. I know Gills Creek watershed is kind of a mess. So I think definitely more policy actions to be taken, just because it's difficult to mobilize a lot of individual action.
I saw two more questions. Let's hear both questions, and then we'll go down the line one more time with those. Go ahead.
I read an article last week about some of the difficulty in getting ideas across to people and getting them to buy in, or their deep cultural beliefs that actually interfere with them understanding that the actual blame to put on for the pollution is something they don't want to touch. Couple of examples. Some of it is such as religious beliefs, traditional relationships to the land and the economy in such a way that the economy becomes more important than quality of life, and handling well at this point. So I wanted to know what our panelists felt about those ideas.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Any other questions? You, sir.
I want to back up what your guest here said. The communication issue. Data is not effective in developing policies unless the information is communicated. And it's got to be communicated by people that are trusted. Big issue. I've been involved with some projects over the years, and one of the things I'm doing with a guy that's a fisherman, and he will ask me a question that actually answers into physiology of fish. And I will say that, and then he'll say, okay, John, now let's do pub talk. And that's his code for talking for the public, not for me, for him. And he says, tell me about that in language that when we sit at the bar with the other fishermen, that fisherman will understand. The same thing holds for politicians. You've got to find the particular thing that they do understand and care about, and then you're the one that has to accommodate them. And when you do that, then you get an initial audience, but you have to keep after it, sustain. And good data does not assume that you'll get good policy.
So I think both of these questions are getting at this kind of sense of who's your audience, and how do you move them from where they are, whatever the beliefs and values are that they hold, and how do you move them from there, whether it's through discussion, debate, data. What is it that you do when you have very different beliefs in front of you and very different standpoints?
Different egos.
Egos, values, money versus,
I
right?
have a question that may tie in with that. I just recently purchased some country out in a rural area where my elderly mother lives. Been traveling, living my life, and now I come back and buy this property. I have hauled off 11 tons of trash. Unbeknownst to me and my naivety and, you know, life is good and everything's copacetic, there's some drug dealings going on. But one thing I noticed coming back, it just seems like the whole town is dilapidated and rundown mobile homes with the single pane windows from 1982 with the brown, rusty orange colored carpet. And everyone that I have come in contact with in Art to Help or to be charitable with, they're running 80 electric heaters in their home just to have it run out the window. And obviously, I mean, you know, Helen Keller can see that that's not good for the environment to live in such dilapidated conditions. And when you try to speak to anyone in authority or that can help, or, you know, how can you break through the egos that, you know, we don't care what's going on because our ego is concerned with power, greed, money. You know, what can someone do? Just, you know, the average Joe like me or anyone. That's why I brought my niece here today, because we see everything happening in the community. And what do? We've tried kicking in the doors, we've tried doing everything, and no one listens.
So questions of how do we get through?
Right.
I'm not sure I'm gonna say anything different, because the questions are answering one another in some sense. I would go back to Abdi's point is that whoever your audience is, it's not one message, because there are many audiences, right? So understanding and digging deep into what the value system is. One of my favorite climate scientists and now climate activists is Catherine Hayhoe, and she describes this scene of going to a club, and at the club she reads the principles that they abide by. She says, "Can I have 10 minutes?" She gets in the corner and she changes her entire presentation to address the 5 principles that this club abides by, and she was able to change the message about climate advocacy in the perfect way for that particular venue. And I think we need to work harder at that, at presenting the data, at making it convincing, and at finding out what does the audience actually care about, what do they actually value, and I think we have lots of opportunities for that.
Yeah, I mean, for me, kind of coming out of a field that's really concerned with understanding belief systems around all kinds of things in the world as a cultural anthropologist, I think it's a very unique problem in terms of thinking about environmental issues. And you know, sometimes I think actually trying to step outside of the perspectives that we hold and the kind of common sense values that we assume should be shared by everybody else, trying to understand why people see an environmental problem differently maybe than we do. So, you know, why it's more palatable to recycle for most Americans than it is to reduce their reliance on fossil fuels is a big thing, and that's not about climate change denial or anything like that. That's about what we're used to and our expectations of how to live our everyday lives. And it's sometimes easier to kind of demonize people who pollute or litter or don't recycle more so than kind of looking at our own practices as well and the things we also kind of take for granted as just normal. So, you know, trying to ask, well, why is it in that one community maybe that they seem to be, you know, abusing like energy or like letting kind of heat roll out the window, like, well, understanding a bit and asking, well, what is the circumstance of these people, you know, what are their resources, what is their relationship to thinking about energy? Yeah, and it's hard. Yeah, they're hard questions to answer, but I think a lot of that has to do with kind of breaking down where we're all kind of situated differently in terms of how we approach these problems, and maybe from there trying to build dialogues, but also reflecting on, you know, where we come from and why we think our ideas are the best ones or the best ways to approach problems, because there's a lot of ways to think about these things.
So from my experience with environmental activism, I will say that it's mainly a white movement. Most of the people involved are white, they're usually well off, they're well educated, and they share the same political mindset. But unfortunately, environmental issues don't just affect white people, they affect everyone. And I know that for me personally, unless I stumbled upon like that CNN article about Flint, Michigan, I probably wouldn't have a care in the world. Or I don't want to say that I wouldn't care, but I wouldn't be as involved with environmental issues as I am now. So I feel like moving forward, environmental activism needs to become more actively seek diversity, because while we're not intentionally excluding people, if we aren't seeking their voices, then we're unintentionally making them unheard. So I feel like moving forward, we need to seek more diversity, and I also feel that we need to change the dialogue in regards to environmental activism, because like the movie said, and like it's right there when talking about pub talk, when we are talking about environmental activism, we can use terms and terminology that are just very intimidating and they're unrelatable towards the general population. And that can just be something that's very unwelcoming. And if we aren't trying to make people welcome, then we're essentially saying that our issue is not important to them and this is something that they shouldn't be involved in.
Yeah, I agree that the environmental movement is mostly isolated, unfortunately, especially in like the white upper class of America, but also like the Western countries as a whole, like worldwide. And also it's been like highly politicized. So I think the whole thing needs to, like, people need to recognize that this is not, it should not be used as like political ammunition. It should be something that we all need to be addressing equally. I mean, honestly, I have no idea how you present data to fix this problem. But I think that's what needs to happen. So,
Huge thank you to our panel. Thank you very much to our students on the panel.